And okay. And today he's going to give us a keynote lecture on bugs and features in corporate reorganization. Please, Ed.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Fernando. It's a great honor to be able to give this keynote address. And what I'm going to do in the next 40, 50 minutes, and then leave time for questions, is set out a little bit of the lay of the land in corporate restructuring and where the literature is and how that connects to some recent work that I'm doing. And I'm going to pivot to that recent work because I welcome your thoughts on that, in which I'll make the case that, as much of the literature has made, that certain features of the corporate reorganization process that look potentially pathological are in fact not a bug, but a feature. So this is, this trite saying from computer programming that what looks like a defect might in fact be a virtue. And that's going to be part of the case I'm going to make today for some features of our current reorganization process. Just to, maybe to steal a little thunder, is that many complain that senior creditors exercise too much control in the corporate reorganization process. And I'm going to show in a paper I work on with some co-authors that this creditor control that is seen by many as pathological actually has important virtues in reducing overall bankruptcy costs. But I'll get there in a moment. So let me just start. I think it comes probably, and what I'm going to try to do, because not many of you, I'm assuming that not many of you are as nerdy about bankruptcy and find it as interesting as I do. So I'm going to try to bring you into the conversation in corporate reorganization and then take you to my work. So it may come as no surprise, but it might. But what is bankruptcy? And bankruptcy, again, let's start with jargon. Bankruptcy in the United States describes both consumer bankruptcy and corporate restructuring. So in some countries called insolvency law, we call bankruptcy law. But anyhow, bankruptcy is designed to solve the collective action problem. So going back to the work of people like Baird and Jackson and others, the idea is that the typical distressed corporation has a fragmented capital structure with dispersed creditors who cannot coordinate. And because they cannot coordinate, that when they see the firm in distress, each acts independently to collect what's owed to that creditor. And because they act independently, each of them rushes to the courthouse or takes other steps to collect debt. And in the process, they all descend on the firm and rip it apart, causing premature liquidation. See, the idea is that bankruptcy offers a collectivizing device that solves this collective action problem. Okay, that's very simple. It's an important baseline that I'm going to come back to again and again, even though it's so simple, this idea that a fragmented capital structure, meaning lots of dispersed creditors, inhibits cooperation, and that lack of cooperation can endanger a firm when it's in distress. It's a very simple idea, but it's very powerful, and I'll come back to it multiple times. Now, the most important thing is that coordination problems are endogenous. Like, why would a firm choose a fragmented capital structure? Now, to be sure, some firms enter distress and they didn't choose it. You could think of a firm that has manufactured a defective product, didn't think it was defective, and there's a tort or some mass poisoning, and there are lots of creditors out there, meaning victims, and that could be a surprise. Or you're a railroad and one of your rail cars explodes and hurts a lot of people. To be sure, there are some firms that have surprise fragmentation in their capital structure, but the vast majority of firms, probably 99%, choose a fragmented capital structure. They choose to have dispersed creditors, dispersed bondholders, for example, or even syndicated loans with 20 or more banks that are all part of a syndicate, and they set it up. The firms set up their capital structures to inhibit collective action. Now, some of you may have heard about bank syndicated agreements that have collective action clauses, but even those clauses require unanimous consent to a lot of changes in the credit agreement. So most firms set up their capital structures to inhibit collective action. And that's a problem. You might say, well, why is it a problem if there's bankruptcy law to bail you out? Well, bankruptcy law is really costly. There are a lot of deadweight costs of bankruptcy. There's a big literature on that it can, depending on the size of the firm, can destroy from 25% of firm value to as low as maybe 5% of firm value. But it's a true loss, and these are thought to be bankruptcy-specific costs. But even in bankruptcy, much of the recent literature points to a lot of defects in our bankruptcy process, at least in the United States. There's a long-standing risk that judges will be biased in favor of keeping a firm alive. Why lose jobs? Let's keep the firm alive. So there's a risk of excessive continuation. And then more recently, much of the literature is focused on the idea that there's our bankruptcy process in the United States is one where senior creditors exercise a lot of control, meaning that senior creditors can force a firm into a sale or a restructuring, into a liquidation, or steal value. There's a phenomenon that's many thought that senior creditors, in collaboration with shareholders, will steal value from unsecured creditors. And let me stop as a matter of jargon. See, in the United States, and in this paper, in this talk, I'm going to use the word senior creditor as a synonym for a secured creditor, meaning a creditor who has the right to seize collateral in the event of default. And I'm going to use junior creditor as a synonym for unsecured creditor. And that's a creditor who in the event of default has no particular rights to any particular property, but can go to court and demand payment and force the firm to pay. Senior creditors, so most firms have many layers of debt. They'll have senior debt, they'll have junior debt, and they'll have things in the middle, like, you know, things that are like less senior than the most senior debt, but more senior than the most junior debt. So anyhow, what we see in the bankruptcy is that secured creditors, these senior lenders, basically can bias the bankruptcy process. They can steal value. They can force the firm into a liquidation. On top of that, there's a phenomenon that in bankruptcy, firms, the reason you're in bankruptcy if you're a firm is because you've run out of money. You wouldn't be there otherwise. So where are you going to get the money? Well, you're going to go to a bank and try to get new loans. And you might think, wow, that's perverse. Who's going to loan to a firm in bankruptcy? Lots of people want to loan to firms in bankruptcy in the United States, because the way our law works is that if you loan to a firm in bankruptcy, you automatically get the highest priority, meaning that you get paid first. Okay, so these are called DIP lenders. A DIP is just an acronym. We can talk about it in Q&A, but just go with me on this. So a DIP is just a special kind of lender in bankruptcy. And these lenders are thought to engage in a lot of abuse, that they make loans at very high rates, very exploitive rates. And you might say, well, wait, if everybody's competing to make these loans, how can there be rent extraction? But in fact, there's a paper that recently documents this by Espen Eckbo and others, showing that, in fact, that the market for lending to firms in bankruptcy is somehow has some pathologies where the lenders are able to earn super competitive returns. And then there's a phenomenon that bankruptcy is also in the United States is subject to being hijacked by hedge funds, often called vulture funds, that threaten negative expected value suits, that they threaten to waste value in order to get a settlement. Now you might say, well, how does that happen? Well, there's a whole literature in civil procedure on negative expected value suits, and we see the same phenomenon in bankruptcy. All this is just to say is to kind of give you a taste for the pathologies that exist in corporate reorganization in the United States. And then it just begs the question, why the hell would a firm choose a fragmented capital structure that exposes you to all this crap? Okay. Most scholars take the position that, well, we don't know why firms choose fragmented capital structures. We do know that there are all these pathological features of the corporate reorganization process. So maybe what we should do is fix those pathological features. And so there's a long literature, and I point to some of the recent hits that are out there that point to things that we could do in the United States and maybe in other countries too, to make the bankruptcy process more efficient or more fair, such as reducing senior lender control. There's this idea that senior creditors, as I said, abuse the process by, so for example, it's thought that senior creditors speed up the case, force the firm to be sold at dirt cheap prices. And even though the prices are too low, they're sufficient to pay the senior creditors, so senior creditors don't care. So people like Jacoby and Janger have said, let's slow down the case. Let's have a rule that says you can't have a quick case, or that we reduce creditor recoveries, as Bebchuk and Fried have argued, that secured creditors get too much out of the process. We should reduce their recoveries so that more goes to junior creditors. Or as Ayat and Elias have argued, that lenders in bankruptcy should have less power over the bankruptcy process. Or as Bebchuk has argued, that equity holders should have less power. You may have heard of something called absolute priority rule. The absolute priority rule is one that says that creditors must be paid before shareholders. Historically, we've seen in the United States a lot of violations of that rule, where shareholders are getting paid even though creditors have not been paid in full. Why is that happening? frequently it's because shareholders in the United States control the bankruptcy process. And I want to pause on that because it's a very important point. In the United States, shareholders choose whether to go into bankruptcy. They choose whether the firm files for bankruptcy. And once in bankruptcy, shareholders control the process. Shareholders, through management, are in charge of proposing a plan of reorganization, deciding whether to sell or not sell the firm, so much so that the bankruptcy law in the United States gives shareholders 18 months of exclusive control. Okay, so there's a lot of control through which shareholders can extract value, divert value from creditors. And so there are proposals by Bebchuk and others to say, hey, let's limit the ability of shareholders to extract value in the same way that they've argued, as Bebchuk and Fried have argued, let's limit the power of secured creditors to extract value. And there are proposals to say to hedge funds, hey, you come in, you launch these negative expected value suits in order to get a settlement. Let's limit your power. One way we're going to limit your power is force you to disclose all of your positions. Well, you might say, well, why is that valuable? Many hedge funds come into bankruptcy and they're long in the debt of the firm, but then they've shorted the same debt or a debt in a different part of the capital structure. So hedge funds will often, they might paradoxically push for a liquidation because they're holding a piece of the capital structure that pays off in a liquidation, or they might be pushing for, using their power as a creditor to push for outcomes that benefit equity holders because they hold some of the equity. We sometimes see shareholders, as I said, they've shorted the debt. So they actually might, paradoxically, a hedge fund might hold the debt, but push for outcomes that reduce the value of that debt because they've shorted it. Okay, so that's why there's proposals to have hedge funds disclose their positions, at least to kind of make everyone alert to the fact that there might be these weird behaviors by hedge funds. So there's all these. So the way the literature has basically worked, to summarize, is that firms need bankruptcy to solve a collective action problem. Next step is, but collective action problems are endogenous. Why would firms choose that? People aren't really sure. They take that as given. They just notice that there are all these pathologies in bankruptcy. And the project now has been to kind of fix the bankruptcy process, to limit the control, limit rent-seeking behavior, maybe make the process more efficient. Now, there's been a parallel literature that says, well, wait, are these things as pathological as we think? That ex post in bankruptcy, we see these pathological things, but maybe ex ante, there are some beneficial incentive effects of having these pathological features ex post. So ex post pathologies might have ex ante beneficial effects. And so this is where I'm riffing on that idea of features versus bugs. Much of the literature says that there are these bugs in the bankruptcy process, but they could be features. And this goes back at least to Bolton and Sharfstein in 1996, when they argued that, a fragmented capital structure isn't such a bad thing, because what it means is that if it's fragmented, it means that a firm, when it's operating, knows that if it enters distress, it faces all of these costs in bankruptcy. It faces this, like if the capital structure is fragmented, it means that when a firm defaults, it faces these massive costs, meaning that the firm knows that these pathologies are out there, and this induces the firm to do two things. One is to try harder to avoid distress, so it has good incentive effects on effort, but it also means that a firm is not going to play games. It's not going to strategically default. Because one of the things you worry about is that a firm might say, hey, I can't pay my debt, offer me some debt forgiveness. Please reduce the debt that I owe. And if you as a creditor, due to asymmetric information, may not be able to verify whether the firm is truly in distress. And so one of the things about a fragmented capital structure is that it reduces the likelihood that a firm is going to strategically default because it's so costly to default. So that was an early intervention that showed that actually a fragmented capital structure can have beneficial ex ante incentive effects, both on effort levels and on the incentive to strategically default. The absolute priority rule, recall that that's a rule that says that you should pay creditors in full before shareholders should get anything. And yet I told you that this rule is violated very frequently, especially historically. We've seen a lot of violations where shareholders are getting paid off. But work by Povell in the 90s and Ayotte in the 2000s showed, well, actually, there are some actually important incentive effects that are very good about this absolute priority rule violation, the APR violation. We thought the APR violation was a bug, but it might be a feature in the sense that APR violations induce managers to come into bankruptcy earlier. remember that I said bankruptcy is controlled by management, by the shareholders. And if an APR violation is basically saying that if you go into bankruptcy, there's still a payoff for you. If you know that there's nothing for you in bankruptcy, you want to avoid it. But if there's something for you, some payoff to you, bankruptcy is less of a deterrent. And so what Povell showed is that firms are more likely to come in, that firms will go into bankruptcy earlier if there's a payoff to shareholders. And he had this, it's called early rescues versus late rescues. It's a simple intuition that it's oftentimes better to save a firm when its problems are young than when its problems are long-standing. And if you have an APR violation, meaning that shareholders can receive a payoff in bankruptcy, firms will reveal their problems earlier in time and be more willing to go into bankruptcy to solve them. EALE has a similar story about effort incentives, kind of, which makes it's similar to what I've said before, that if but it's a little bit different, meaning that if there's an APR, if managers know there's a payoff to them in bankruptcy, they're going to work harder in bankruptcy. So it's kind of this idea that in bankruptcy, it takes managers to rescue the firm. So managers run the firm. And if they know that they're going to get a payoff from running the firm in bankruptcy, an APR violation helps to induce stronger effort in bankruptcy. And finally, there's a really interesting recent paper that talks about the idea that by Burkhardt, Vladimirov, and others, showing that a fragmented capital structure is actually good in the sense that it attracts hedge funds. We used to think that hedge funds, these vulture funds, were bad in the sense they came in and they stole value. But instead, this paper is arguing that hedge funds come in and they take this dispersed capital structure and they start to concentrate it. So after the fact, these hedge funds come in and they buy the debt from unsophisticated investors. They take the debt and put it into the hand of sophisticated investors, the hedge funds, who can achieve efficiencies. So all of these, so that you might say that there's a stream in the literature that's saying, hey, all of these pathological features in bankruptcy might actually have some beneficial effects ex ante, or even have beneficial effects in the bankruptcy process by making, for example, by inducing hedge funds to get involved and to add efficiency to the process. And it's in light of that move, that stream in the scholarship that's suggesting that what looks like a bug might be a feature. It's in light of that stream of scholarship that I have a paper with some co-authors that makes a similar argument. And I'm going to argue in the next few minutes through this paper that I've written that it can be paradoxically efficient to give senior creditors a lot of power, meaning that, let's just put it starkly, I'm going to try to prove to you that it can be efficient for senior creditors to be able to steal, literally steal money from the unsecured creditors in bankruptcy. Now that might say, well, theft is never a good idea, but so it's a caricature of the argument, but I'm going to show you that it can actually be efficient to give senior creditors so much power that they can steal value from junior creditors in bankruptcy. So why would that be true? Well, let me just get that going. So this is a paper called Restructuring versus Bankruptcy with my co-authors, Jason Donaldson, Georgia Piacentino, and Xiaobo Yu. Jason's at Washington University, St. Louis, and Georgia and Xiaobo are with me at Columbia. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this paper up and very much welcome your feedback. It's fairly early and it's a theoretical paper. There's no data. Okay, so here's the basic idea. And I think you're going to roll with me now because I've monologued long enough about the contours of the bankruptcy process that some of this should be pretty intuitive. So first fact, there are two ways to resolve distress when a firm is having problems. One is bankruptcy. We just talked about that, right? That dispersed creditors can't coordinate, so you go into bankruptcy to solve your problems if you're the distressed firm. There's this other possibility that I've basically ruled out. It's called an out-of-court restructuring. Now, I said because of dispersed creditors, that's hard to do. There's a collective action problem that inhibits an out-of-court restructuring, but it is still possible, okay? And in fact, in the real world, it actually happens. So here's the paradox. I've kind of set you up all to think that there's this collective action problem that cannot be solved, so you need bankruptcy, but that's counterfactual. In the real world, that problem is solved a lot of the time through what's called a distressed exchange. The word distressed exchange is most often used for a bond when you do an out-of-court restructuring of bonds. But I'm going to use the word distressed exchange to describe not only a bond restructuring, but it could be bank debt as well. And for those of you who are not comfortable yet with bankruptcy, but are comfortable, however, with civil litigation, an out-of-court restructuring is a settlement. You can think of like that there's a dispute between the creditors and the firm. The firm is not paying the creditors. You could go to court, that's called bankruptcy, or you could settle it out of court, and that's called an out-of-court restructuring, okay? In the data, if you just look at bonds, firms that have issued bonds, they are comparably important. So this is the kind of the paradox. I said that you need bankruptcy, but maybe not. For firms that have issued publicly traded debt, distressed exchanges account for 40% of defaults. So you take all the firms, so this is Moody's data, you take all the firms that have defaulted, 40% of them resolve their distress through a restructuring. Another 40% resolve it through bankruptcy. Then you say, what happens to the other 20%? The other 20%, it turns out those defaults are often technical, like they didn't file their SEC filings on time and they fix the problem a few months later. So you might think of it that among firms that have defaulted and that have a serious problem, those firms are equally likely to do an out-of-court restructuring versus bankruptcy. Okay, so that's the first cool fact that's going to motivate this paper. The second cool fact is that restructurings are not a cure for distress. 17% of restructurings are followed by a bankruptcy in the next 3 years. So here's something cool. In the litigation settlement literature, litigation is off the equilibrium path. So you remember the Mnuchin Kornhauser papers that talk about that you settle in the shadow of the law. So most of the litigation literature tries to come up with under what conditions will you ever go to court, because it's efficient never to go to court in that literature, because you know what happens in court, so you settle out of court. And you have to add asymmetric information or other kinds of problems to get litigation. But litigation is kind of off the equilibrium path. Settlement is on the equilibrium path. Here, however, settlement is on the equilibrium path too. You go into restructuring, but it still leaves open the possibility of litigation later. So think about it this way. A firm enters distress, it could go into bankruptcy or restructuring. If it chooses restructuring, it hasn't closed down the option to go into bankruptcy later. A restructuring could just be a delay. And in fact, for 17% of firms, the restructuring is just a delay of bankruptcy. Now, it's not an intentional delay. All these firms want to stay out of bankruptcy, but future is uncertain. You may not restructure sufficiently to avoid bankruptcy permanently. Okay, this interaction between restructuring and bankruptcy is underexplored in the literature because most of the papers out there conflate them. They say like in default, you go into some procedure, and most of the literature black boxes that, saying that whatever that procedure is, it could be restructuring, it could be bankruptcy, but whatever it is, you go into that in the event of default. This paper takes a step back and say, in default, you have these options. We want to study what is the interaction between these two options, between restructuring and bankruptcy. And well, let me just tell you, these are our questions. How do these two things interact? And more importantly, how do the parameters of the bankruptcy environment affect the probability of restructuring? Okay. And here's the important fact. Bankruptcy is costly. It has deadweight costs. Okay, hold on to that. Restructuring avoids those deadweight costs. To be sure, restructuring is expensive too, but it's not as expensive as bankruptcy. Okay, that's well known not only in the academic literature, but also among practitioners as well. It's always cheaper to restructure. So you might say, okay, that as a matter of social welfare, restructuring is superior. Okay, so the one question we're asking is, well, how, if you change the parameters of the bankruptcy environment, how does that affect the probability of restructuring? And one thing you might think is that because these are options, that the more attractive bankruptcy becomes, the less attractive restructuring becomes. So if you make the bankruptcy process more efficient, maybe more people will use it instead of restructuring, okay? If you make the bankruptcy process more friendly to firms, shareholders are going to choose it instead of restructuring. That's what we mean by crowding out. So what we're asking in this paper is that as you change the parameters of the bankruptcy environment, does that affect the probability of restructuring, and in which direction? And lastly, we wrote this at the beginning of the pandemic, or in the midst of the pandemic, and we asked, well, a lot of the policies during the pandemic were designed to prevent firms from entering bankruptcy, prevent them from failing. We can actually, with our model, evaluate the efficiency of those things, because what our paper is telling us, and it's kind of driven by the assumption, our assumption is that restructuring is cheaper than bankruptcy. It's not even, it's kind of a fact, but that's the key assumption. It means that social welfare should seek, the social planner should seek to foster restructurings, not bankruptcy. And so we think like so when you think about social policy, what are the social policies that will maximize the probability of bankruptcy? And I'll show you at the end of this talk that it turns out that we can rank social policies, and we can show that some of the most common policies in the United States during the pandemic were badly designed, at least in terms of maximizing social welfare. Okay, so that's where we are. Here's what we're doing. We're going to have a model, and I think I have about 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to talk for another 20 minutes and then open up for Q&A for another 20. So I should be able to get through this. We're going to have a model of a firm with a fragmented capital structure. We call that dispersed creditors. There's going to be two options, restructuring versus bankruptcy. And the key elements, which should be familiar by now, is one is that there's a collective action problem that makes restructuring hard. Like, to do a restructuring, all the creditors have to agree. That's hard when you have dispersed creditors. And here I have in blue, each creditor is thinking, hey, and maybe I haven't emphasized this, each creditor is thinking to itself, if other creditors consent to a write down, but I hold out, the firm will become solvent and be able to pay my debt. So I should hold out. I should not write down my debt. So the basic idea is that, and this what I'm getting at, in the typical restructuring, the firm makes an offer to the creditor, say, hey, I owe you 100. How about I only owe you 80? And the creditor's thinking, should I take 80 instead of 100? And an individual creditor is thinking, okay, if everybody rejects the offer, the firm goes into bankruptcy and I might get 60 or 0 or something really bad. It's definitely better to restructure. But in a dispersed capital structure where everybody's acting independently because of the dispersion, I, individual creditor, think, hey, if everybody like Giuseppe and the others on this call accept the offer, they take 80 instead of 100, the firm's debt declines, it becomes solvent, and then it becomes able to pay my debt. So I'm not going to write down my debt. If all of you chumps write down your debt, the firm is solvent and can pay me. So I'm going to hold out. But every creditor thinks the same way, and that leads to a failure of restructuring, which is the collective action problem. So that's one key fact driving the model. The other key fact is that bankruptcy is controlled by the firm's owners. They choose when to file. Okay, and it's actually the second feature that firms choose when to file. That is the one that's largely understudied. Povell has a paper that studies it, but most papers do not incorporate that phenomenon. And that turns out to drive a lot of our results. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the model. It's a simple model, but what's cool about it, it generates a lot of cool results. So it's just 2 dates, today and tomorrow, date 0 and date 1. The firm starts with debt. So the debt is D0 and risky assets. So next period, in period 1, so in period 0, we don't know what the value of the assets are next period. So let's say in period 1, the asset value will be V, it's distributed according to some function F, but some CDF, we don't know what those will be. The firm, however, is in distress, meaning that we have this idea that the firm is likely to default. And so the firm in date 0 is thinking, I'm likely to default next period, in period 1. So it's period 0, I might default next period. So one thing I could do is in period 0, offer a restructuring to my creditors, which means that I'm going to make a take it or leave it offer to my creditors and see if I can reduce my debt at date 0. In date 1, the value of the firm is realized and the firm either repays or files for bankruptcy. So you can think about the structure of the model is in date 0, you can restructure. In date 1, based on what happened in date 0 and date 1, you either pay your debt or you file for bankruptcy. Now you might say, and you might ask in Q&A, well, couldn't you try to restructure at date 1? Yes, we have an appendix that deals with that. So the results I'm presenting today are a simplified version of the model, but we can talk about extensions in Q&A. Okay, so remember our key facts, that at date 0, you're going to think about restructuring. There's a collective action problem that's going to make that hard. At date 1, you can choose to pay or file for bankruptcy, and the firm chooses it. Okay, let's think about date 0. So the firm's going to make a take it or leave it offer, and we consider take it or leave it offers where you say to creditors, hey, I owe you 100. Why don't you take new debt worth 80? Or hey, I owe you 100. Why don't I give you ownership of the firm? So we could restructure and give the creditors debt or equity in exchange for what they're originally owed. And our key assumption is that each creditor acts atomistically, independently, that I make my decision, taking others' decisions as given. Okay, so we're ruling out coordination. In an extension of the model, we consider what happens when there's a possibility of coordination. The results change, we can talk about them, but the overall thrust of our results remains the same as long as there's some coordination problem. Okay, date one, like I said, at date 0, you decide to restructure or not. And at date 1, you realize the value of the firm and you decide whether to pay or not. You either pay the firm, pay your creditors, or you file for bankruptcy. And at date 1, the assets are realized and you repay your debt. And the debt we're going to call D. It could be, if there was a restructuring in period 0, D will be some value of debt lower than the initial value of debt. If there was no restructuring, D is equal to D0, meaning that there was no reduction in the value of the debt. What we assume is that in bankruptcy, value is destroyed. So we have a parameter of the bankruptcy environment called lambda, which measures the deadweight cost of bankruptcy. You might think of it as how much value is pissed away because you have to be in bankruptcy. You have to pay the lawyers, the accountants, the financial advisors, there's delay, there's all these costs, okay? And so there's the value of the firm. So if you go into bankruptcy, one minus lambda is the measure of bankruptcy costs. So I shouldn't say it's not lambda, it's 1 minus lambda is the measure of the bankruptcy costs. We scaled it we wrote it this way. So the idea would be that high lambda means a very efficient bankruptcy, low lambda means an inefficient bankruptcy environment. So what this says is that 1 minus lambda of the firm is destroyed in bankruptcy. And that's gonna happen regardless. And in bankruptcy, once you get in there, you destroy 1 minus lambda of the firm, and then you take the rest of it and you split up the remaining value, which is lambda V. So 1 minus lambda is destroyed. That leaves lambda V as the remaining value of the firm. And that is split between equity and debt. Now you might say, wait, what about the absolute priority rule? We're assuming in this model that shareholders can steal value, or that there's some way that the owners of the firm can extract or tunnel value out of the firm. So when you take the value of the firm in bankruptcy, it's lambda V. So the value of the firm is V. The amount of that's not destroyed by bankruptcy is lambda. So you might say like lambda could be 90%. So 90% of the firm is preserved. 90% of the value of the firm is available for distribution. And then it's split between equity and debt. Share creditors get a theta of the firm. So they might get 70% of the firm, and the other 30% goes to shareholders. So theta tells us how much of the firm goes to creditors. And so 1 minus theta is what goes to equity. Okay, so why am I doing this? It's to set up the decision rule. So shareholders in period 1 will file for bankruptcy if bankruptcy pays them more than not. So I'll file for bankruptcy if 1 minus theta is better than what I get if I repay the debt. If I repay the debt, and it's only a 2-period model, so shareholders get whatever remains after paying the creditors. So if I repay the debt, I as a shareholder get V minus D. If I go into bankruptcy, I get a share of the value of the firm that's preserved in bankruptcy. Lambda V is what's preserved in bankruptcy, and I get 1 minus theta of that. Theta goes to creditors and the rest goes to me. Now, so what that means is that I'll file for bankruptcy if this is greater than that. And if you play with that, you get a decision rule that says that I will file for bankruptcy whatever the value of the firm is below this threshold. If you just set this inequality, you can say you get to this result, which just basically says that the value of the firm falls below the debt scaled by these parameters, I'll file for bankruptcy. A cool feature of this is that a firm will file for bankruptcy even when it's solvent. The idea being that even if a firm is solvent, I still might file for bankruptcy because there is this ability of the shareholders to extract value in bankruptcy. Okay, so that's the threshold. Now, then we say, okay, so you might say, okay, so we have the shareholders' decision rule. Let's think about the creditors' decision rule. When will creditors accept a restructuring? Okay, so take a step back. Here's what happens in period 1. Let's go back to period 0 and do some backward induction and think about, given what happens in period 1, here's what's going to happen in period 1. That's what the shareholders' decision rule is. Okay, in period 0, will I as a creditor accept a restructuring offer, and what kinds will I accept? The first thing is we think about, well, what if you have a restructuring offer where you say, you the firm, say the creditors, hey, I'll give you debt with the same priority, meaning that I owe you all on an unsecured basis. You're all unsecured creditors. You're all owed 100 each. I'll give you 80 each. This is called pari passu debt, debt with the same priority as the old debt. what we can show, and this is really a well-known result going back to Gertner, Sharfstein, and Rowe, is that no creditor will accept a restructuring for debt with the same priority as the old debt. And the simple idea is that because I'm thinking to myself, well, gosh, if other people agree to write down their debt, the firm becomes solvent, and therefore I should not reduce my debt. It's almost a repeat of what I said before. The simple intuition is that the firm's saying to everybody, hey, reduce your debt to 80. I, as a creditor, think, okay, when should I accept a restructuring? If all other creditors reject, I should reject too, because there's no reason, if everyone's going to reject, the firm's going to go into bankruptcy anyway, so I should not restructure my debt. If all the other creditors accept, I should still reject, because if they accept, the firm becomes solvent and can pay me off. So I'm going to free ride. So this is that same intuition before that I gave before, is that creditors free ride on each other, that I hold out as a creditor because everybody else is restructuring. And so this is an old result, and it goes back to, I said, like Gertner, Sharfstein, and Rowe, that there's this massive holdout problem that prevents a restructuring. But empirically, as I said, restructurings are common, and they've happened a lot during the pandemic. So here's a bunch of firms that did a distressed exchange. What is it about these distressed exchanges that made them possible? And the one thing that's common to them all is that when firms do a restructuring, they don't say, hey, I owe you 100, let me give you just a claim for 80, and that 80 is at the same priority as the old debt. No. What they say is, I owe you 100, I'm gonna give you a claim for 80, but that 80 is secured. It's a senior debt. I'm gonna give you not just a lower claim, but higher priority. That's the sweetener that gets creditors to come along. Say, creditors, I'm gonna show this in a moment, are willing to take less. Like, I'm owed 100, I will take 80 as long as I get priority as well. Now, this is our first result, and we call it R0 because it's kind of a non-result. It's old news. People like Gertner and Sharfstein and Eric Talley have proven this in previous work. But I'm going to set it out here because once we have this result on the table, we can get to the new results in our paper. So simply is that, remember I said that a firm is going to accept a restructuring that reduces its debt from its initial value to some lower value if they can get higher priority. Why is that? Because the individual creditor is thinking, hey, if I accept the payoff, if I accept a restructuring, I get a payoff here, which says that what this says is F of V is the probability of bankruptcy. So 1 minus F of V is the probability of no bankruptcy. If there's no bankruptcy, I get that debt. If the debt is reduced in value from D0 to D, and there's no bankruptcy, I get D. If there is a bankruptcy, I get my share of the firm's value. Okay, this is what happens if I accept the restructuring. If I reject the restructuring, what's going to happen? Well, think about this. The creditor is thinking, what happens if I reject and everybody else accepts? If everybody else accepts, that means the firm's debt will go down and the firm will become solvent. But there's still a probability of bankruptcy in the future. As I said, 17% of restructurings are followed by bankruptcy. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, if everybody accepts and I reject, what happens then? Well, if I reject, that means that there's a chance the firm will not file for bankruptcy. If it doesn't, I'm going to get paid my debt in full. And this is that old intuition that if everybody accepts and I reject and the firm remains solvent, I get paid in full. That's D0. But if the firm does file for bankruptcy, remember that I've rejected, everyone else has accepted. All the other people who've accepted, they are senior to me. That was the term of the restructuring. Everybody else who accepted is now senior to me. And if they're senior to me, that means in bankruptcy, they get paid first. And in a typical bankruptcy, if they get paid first, there's nothing for me. And so that means that if there is a bankruptcy, I get 0. And that is the magic here, which is that the threat of getting nothing in bankruptcy induces creditors to accept a restructuring. Okay, sometimes this is sometimes described pejoratively as a hold-in problem, that the firm can threaten, say, you accept this restructuring because if you don't, you'll get nothing in bankruptcy. But as negative as that sounds, it solves the collective action problem, and it explains why restructuring is common in the real world, because the way you induce creditors to come along is by offering them priority. Okay, now this is an old result. This is well known. Okay, what we add to it is that with our simple model, we can write down this thing called D0 versus D. That's how much the debt has been written down from its original level to its new level. We call that the write down. And in our model, we can say that the maximum write down, the most creditors are willing to write down the debt, is a function of two things. It's in this expression, but the first expression is saying the maximum they're willing to accept is a function of the probability of bankruptcy. That's this odds ratio, and the payoff in bankruptcy. So it's kind of like my maximum, the write down I'm willing to accept as a creditor is a function of the probability of bankruptcy and my expected recovery in bankruptcy. The more likely bankruptcy becomes, the more I'm willing to write down the debt. It's kind of paradoxical. Wait, the more likely the bankruptcy becomes, the more likely I am to write down the debt. Why would that be? It's because the value of priority exists in bankruptcy only. Everybody have to pause on that. That outside of bankruptcy, if a firm remains solvent, everyone gets paid. It doesn't matter who's first, who's second, everyone gets paid. The only time priority matters is inside bankruptcy, because inside bankruptcy, the senior folks get paid first and junior second. So when I write down the debt, remember, I'm agreeing to a write down. I'm willing to take less because I'm getting priority. What makes priority valuable? Priority is valuable the more likely bankruptcy becomes and the more I get in bankruptcy. And that's the second expression, theta lambda v. It's saying that I'm willing to write down my debt if in the event of bankruptcy, I get more and bankruptcy is more likely. Another way of saying it is that, remember, firms, creditors write down their debt because they get priority. What makes priority valuable? Priority is more valuable the more likely bankruptcy becomes and the more you get in bankruptcy as a creditor. Now, the key here for us is that you could see here from this expression that as you increase the efficiency of the bankruptcy process, lambda, or you increase the payoff to creditors, obviously, as theta and lambda v go up, that makes the write down go up. So restructuring becomes more feasible, the more power creditors have, and the more efficient the bankruptcy process is. That's kind of well known in the literature. But what we're adding to the model is that F of V, the probability of bankruptcy, is endogenous. It too is a function of the parameters. And it turns out that it's surprising what happens. And so that when we account for the endogeneity of the bankruptcy process. So let's turn to that, and then I'll be pretty close towards the end. Is that our first result is that bankruptcy, a more efficient bankruptcy is used less often. I think that's like kind of the cool result of this paper is that the more efficient bankruptcy becomes, the less often it is used. And why is that? The more efficient the bankruptcy process becomes, the more likely restructuring becomes. Bankruptcy and restructuring are complements, not substitutes. And the reason for that is simply just, you just go back to this expression. If you increase lambda, obviously the payoff to creditors goes up because lambda, remember, is the efficiency of the bankruptcy process. As lambda goes up, less of the firm is destroyed. Efficient bankruptcy process means more of the pie is distributable to equity and debt, okay? But it turns out as lambda goes up, that's good also for increasing the probability of bankruptcy. As lambda goes up, creditor payoffs go up, but shareholder payoffs go up as well. Remember that shareholders get a share of the value of the firm. As you increase the value of the firm in bankruptcy, more goes to shareholders. And shareholders see that, and then they want to file for bankruptcy. So it turns out increasing lambda increases not just the payoff in bankruptcy, but the probability of bankruptcy too. It's an unambiguous effect going in both directions. So what that means is that the write down is increasing. Remember, the write down is increasing in the probability of bankruptcy and the payoff. Both go up as you make bankruptcy more efficient. So it's a kind of cool result because most of the literature assumes that in the distress, you choose one or the other. They look like substitutes, but actually as a policy matter, you make bankruptcy more efficient, you get more restructuring. And around the world, including Spain, for example, restructuring that bankruptcy is not very commonly used. What our paper suggests is that in many environments, if you see a bankruptcy process rarely used, one possibility is that it's actually a pretty good, efficient process. I'm not saying that's true for Spain, but one of the phenomena you look across the world is why is bankruptcy not used? Well, because one possibility is that as you make it more efficient, you're going to see it used less. Here's our next result, which is that what about creditor friendliness? It can actually help or hinder restructuring. The idea is to go up here, go up to this expression. Obviously, as you make the bankruptcy process more creditor friendly, that means that more of the firm goes to creditors, not to shareholders. That means theta goes up. Theta is the share of the firm that goes to creditors. So in this expression right here, this is saying how much of the firm in bankruptcy goes to creditors. If theta goes up, more of the firm goes to creditors. But what's the effect of theta over here? it reduces the probability of bankruptcy, because if more goes to creditors, shareholders don't want to go there. Because if you increase the recoveries to shareholders, you're reducing the recoveries to equity holders. Sorry, if you increase the recovery to creditors, you're reducing the recovery to shareholders. Shareholders control the bankruptcy filing process, and so they don't want to go in there when they get less. So you have these competing effects that if you raise creditor friendliness, that's theta, you increase this expression, but you reduce this expression, and it has an ambiguous effect. We don't know if creditor friendliness improves or reduces the probability of restructuring. Now you might say, well, Morrison, how is that helpful? Well, it's kind of helpful because is that we can actually derive in our model a sufficient statistic that says under what conditions can we say that a firm's that a country's bankruptcy environment is so creditor friendly that it deters restructuring. We can look and what our model is able to, we can parameterize our model and say that there is a trade-off that as you increase creditor friendliness, that bankruptcy becomes more attractive to creditors and less attractive to shareholders. But there could become a point when theta is so high that if you just reduce theta a little bit, you'd have a small effect on creditor recoveries, but a big effect on shareholder decisions to file. So we can parameterize this and we can take it to the data using estimates from the literature, and we can show that the US bankruptcy system is too creditor friendly. That if you made the bankruptcy system in the United States less creditor friendly, you get more restructurings, which would save value. So that too, we think is a cool result, because around the world, the assumption is that the United States bankruptcy process is really debtor friendly. But we can show that actually, at least as measured in terms of avoiding social waste, the United States bankruptcy system is overly creditor friendly. So this goes to the bugs and features, and I'll close out with this because I only have about 20 minutes left, and I'll do this kind of quickly because I think right now you get the basic intuitions that, so the first thing we do is say, let's think about creditor power. Maybe I could just summarize this very simply, is that, remember that the reason that creditors agree to a restructuring is the value of priority, that I'm willing to take less as long as I get priority. So anything that makes priority more valuable will increase the probability of restructuring. And that's good for social welfare because that avoids bankruptcy. Okay, so then you could say, okay, how do we make priority more valuable? Well, one is giving, remember that, we'll just go back to this expression here. This is such a useful way to think about it, that if we can increase the payoff in bankruptcy without affecting this probability of filing, that is unambiguously good, okay? So if you give secured creditors the power to steal from junior creditors, that increases senior creditors' payoff, but has no effect on the filing because you're not stealing from shareholders, you're just stealing from juniors. So the idea here is that, and it's kind of cool, it means that if I'm a creditor and I'm trying to decide, should I agree to a restructuring? I'm thinking to myself, priority is really valuable, but it's especially valuable if I know in bankruptcy, I'm going to get screwed. People are going to steal from me. I totally want seniority because I don't want to be the guy getting thwacked in bankruptcy. So it turns out that the ability of senior creditors to take value from juniors creates a bigger wedge between senior creditor payoff and junior creditor payoff. And so creditors think, I want to be senior. I don't want to be a junior. So it turns out it's very important to protect secured creditor rights in bankruptcy. Another thing is that, so this is in contrast to work by Bebchuk and others that say we should reduce senior creditor power in bankruptcy. The payoff here is to say, no. You want to give senior creditors full protection in bankruptcy because the more protected senior creditors are, the more likely you are to get a restructuring. Why is that? Because fully protected senior creditors are creditors with really powerful priority. That, put differently, that when you protect senior creditors, you're giving them a lot of priority. The more valuable priorities, the more likely you are to get a restructuring, which is good for social welfare. Similarly, for absolute priority rule violations, it turns out that the literature either goes one or the other direction. They say either we should have an absolute priority or not have it. Ours is actually nuanced. It turns out that APR violations, remember the APR rule says that creditors get paid before equity. It technically is a little more complicated. It means that seniors get paid before juniors and juniors get paid before equity. What we're showing on our model is that you really don't want creditors, what you want is APR violations that favor equity at the expense of creditors, those are ambiguous in effect. That's like affecting theta. Remember, in theta is the share of the firm that goes to creditors. And we said that if you increase that, it's unclear whether that helps or hurts restructuring. So an APR violation that benefits shareholders at the expense of creditors, it's unclear whether that is socially welfare enhancing or not. So that's our first intervention, which is that most of the literature thinks they say we should have it or not. And we're showing in our paper that it's not clear. It's very complicated to figure out whether APR violations are bad when those APR violations are at equity benefiting the expense of creditors. But what we do show is that an APR violation where seniors are stealing from juniors, that's okay. What is terrible is an APR violation where juniors are stealing from seniors. You never want that. So the idea is that what our paper says is that you never want violations that allow junior creditors to benefit the expense of senior creditors, because what essentially that means is that if junior creditors can benefit at the expense of senior creditors, that's diluting the value of priority. Anything that dilutes priority is bad in our model. Okay, I think I'm really close to out of time. What we do is we rank COVID relief policies. That's really not the ambit of my presentation today. We can talk about that in Q&A. I can tell you which policies work, which don't, but you can sense it. The magic is that any policy that encourages restructuring is good, and some policies do, some don't. And then in the paper also we consider problems of court congestion, debt overhang. So obviously the way people give me a hard time, or my co-authors when we present this paper, is they say, "Hey Morrison, in your model, you think you're all endogenizing everything, but you made the debt exogenous. D0 is exogenous in your model." Yes, I confess, D0 is exogenous. We said it there. We're assuming the firm is in distress. And then you might say, well, you say that it's good to have an efficient bankruptcy process, that you said it's good to encourage anything that encourages restructuring, but what if you endogenize debt? We're working on that extension, but we think that in our extensions, we can still show that it's always better to encourage restructuring, even when debt is endogenous. And then we play with creditor concentration, like what would happen if you have a we have this atomistic dispersion of creditors. What if some creditors are concentrated, others disperse? What does a restructuring look like in that world? Nothing much changes. The paper's on SSRN. We're about to post a revised version in the next few weeks. But I will now open it up to Q&A. I know there's a lot there, but I really welcome your remarks or comments. And Fernando, can you help me field questions if there are any? Oh, I can't hear you, Fernando. I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, let me see whether, well, I think we already have one question, so please, Yun Chen, go ahead.
Hi, Ed.
Hi,
greetings from Taipei. Very fun and interesting talk. I know nothing about bankruptcy, but if you would indulge me, I'll play my best Tom Merrill incarnation in asking you about a property dimension of the paper. So given the numerous clauses principle and what you would say the interim effect, I was wondering how come a restructuring, which seems to be like a private agreement, can make someone suddenly become a senior creditor over fellow creditors who remain junior. You know what I mean? If the company gets mortgage or some kind of pledge, then I understand it. So could you tell more about the mechanism where a company in distraught could suddenly come up with assets and then give it to some of the creditors?
Yeah, so this is a cool point. And it's actually, there's a new paper by Effie Ben Melek and some others who show something that's very useful for us, is that in the past, I think it goes back even 100 years, there's been a secular decline in senior debt. That secured debt is a very small percentage of the capital structure of most firms. And it's become increasingly smaller, meaning that the typical firm has no senior debt. It's all junior. And in the event of distress, the firm will suddenly issue secured debt, meaning that, as in our paper, the firm will say to its existing capital structure, which is all junior, meaning it's all, you might say, what does it mean to be junior if there's no other debt? Meaning it's all unsecured. So the typical firm only has unsecured debt. When the firm enters distress, then it goes to those unsecured creditors and restructures by offering these unsecured creditors the ability to become senior. And so what it says is that if you give up your old claims, we'll give you a new claim with a security interest in collateral. And your question is, how is there any collateral? Well, there's a lot of collateral because most of these firms don't have any secured debt. And we're working on, so there is an empirical piece that's a follow-on to show this, but we can see through a lot of examples, anecdotal, that many firms have zero secured debt, and then about a year or two before their bankruptcy, go from having no secured debt to having so much secured debt it encumbers all the assets. So like a fully leaned up firm. Is that kind of answering your question? But what's kind of cool about this is that our paper suggests that you can only do this once, because once you issue senior debt, how do you do this again? Now, what's really cool is that there's a lot of recent litigation in the United States. You may have heard about it. It was in J. Crew and Serta Simmons and Trimark, which was a movie company, where firms had done a restructuring. They'd replaced their junior debt with senior debt. And then they did a restructuring, then they entered distress again, and they want to do what we're talking about in the paper, but the only way to do what we're talking about in the paper is to give more priority. If you already have senior debt, how do you give more priority than that? Well, many firms have been creative in finding ways to give super senior debt. There's a lot of litigation whether it's possible. So what they do is they issue new debt that says, though you're secured by the same collateral, we will pay you before the other creditors. So we're announcing a contractual priority. Like you said, secured debt is a property right, but some firms have now issued contractual rights to seniority as well. So the game is still that what we see in the data and we're seeing today is exactly what our paper is talking about, is the only way to avoid a bankruptcy is to restructure. The only way to restructure is to have a coin that your creditors value, and the coin the creditors value is priority. And so for a firm with no secure debt, that's easy to give that coin. If you have a lot of secured debt, it's hard, but firms are being creative and trying to offer that today.
So maybe a short, quick follow-up. Do firms use like asset partitioning to kind of reroute and give some?
Yes, okay. Exactly. So J. Crew, I don't know. So J. Crew is a popular clothing store in the United States, but it had a subsidiary called Madewell, and Madewell makes things well. It's like a popular brand. It's actually, it turns out it's the only thing that was valuable that they did, really. And so what they did in bankruptcy, or maybe it was before bankruptcy, they moved Madewell into a separate entity and had that entity issue new secured debt. So basically, the fight here is that everybody who was a creditor of J. Crew thought Madewell was their collateral, but the contract was one that was sufficiently vague that the lawyers moved Madewell out of J. Crew, out of the collateral available to the J. Crew creditors, moved Madewell into a separate entity and had that entity issue new debt that was collateralized by the Madewell intellectual property. So yeah, so it's unclear whether that was legal. So to be decided.
Yes, Hagai.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the fascinating talk. I actually want to ask you about, and I'm not sure, maybe you prefer not to talk about it, about the endogenizing the debt, the extension. So I guess I'll let you speak for yourself, but I'm guessing that you're adding kind of a -1 period when kind of the debtors kind of decide whether to buy debt and how much, and kind of in anticipation of the future periods. And I was wondering, in addition to their decision to whether to buy the debt given the returns, then the expected returns, whether you also allow the debt to affect kind of the distribution of V, like the F function, because I think that would be interesting kind of to incorporate kind of the question of the debt equity ratio, which kind of would also allow kind of, you will let the firm kind of have an incentive regarding how much debt it wants, and not just the debtors deciding, what's their, expected return rates, anticipating bankruptcy or restructuring.
Yeah, that's a great question. One is that it turns out to be extremely hard to endogenize the debt. Even as simple as our model is, it's hard. One reason is there's so many reasons to issue debt: tax reasons, liquidity reasons. There's a lot of different reasons, and depending on the reason you're issuing debt, that it's hard to model it. And so to be honest, we're struggling with the endogenizing debt because it's so complicated. But one of our intuitions is that step one, just think about this, that restructurings avoid deadweight loss that harms everybody, including creditors. So our intuition is that anything that avoids a deadweight loss ex post has got to be beneficial ex ante. It makes the firm more valuable. So our thought is that policies that encourage restructuring avoid waste. Anything that avoids waste is going to increase the borrowing capacity of a firm. So our simple theory is that we expect that policies that encourage restructuring will actually, if anything, increase the liquidity or increase the liquidity available or the size of the loans available to a firm ex ante. Now, we still have to prove that, but that's our simple intuition. We're still working on that. But we do have an extension dealing with debt overhang. I cut those slides out, but it's really interesting, and it goes to what you're talking about. It's in the paper, but the simple idea is that the problem with debt overhang is it's very similar to what Haggai is talking about. That remember, the problem with debt overhang is that debt distorts the effort incentives of management, and which affects F of V. That a management that doesn't work as hard, like if there's a lot of debt overhang, management don't work as hard, and that increases the probability of bankruptcy because management aren't working as hard. And so you could say, well, a restructuring therefore seems like it would be good for effort incentives, because if you restructure the debt, you reduce the amount of debt that's outstanding. That means that managers want to work harder because their firm is not as indebted. But we show in the paper, it's actually complicated. It depends upon how does effort translate into payoffs. So if management effort just increases the value of the firm, but does not in bankruptcy, but has no effect on the probability, then it's always good to restructure. Creditors always want to structure because they know that by reducing the debt, management work harder, and that increases creditor payoffs in bankruptcy. But what if restructuring not just affects the payoff in bankruptcy, but reduces the probability of bankruptcy? Now it's paradoxical. Creditors think, I'm not sure I want to restructure this debt, because if I restructure this debt, it's true, management will work harder, but if management work harder, bankruptcy is less likely, and that makes priority less valuable. So remember that I restructure as priority gets more valuable, but if I restructure and management incentives are such that bankruptcy becomes less likely, then priority is less valuable. So we show in our paper is that we can't really, it's interesting, but it's kind of a mess, but we're able to show that it's not clear whether in the presence of debt overhang, whether creditors are more or less likely to restructure, because there's this trade-off that if I restructure the debt, that gives management better incentives, but those incentives have two effects. One, it makes priority more valuable by making the firm more valuable, but it makes priority less valuable because bankruptcy becomes less likely. So I'll just say, I'll point to the paper. The math is hairy, but the payoff in terms of this trade-off is kind of cool.
Yes, Rosa, please.
Yes, a bit related. I was wondering if there must be a threshold value on the number of senior creditors, because I completely buy the argument, but I feel like there is a point in which too many senior creditors just completely crowd out junior creditors. And in fact, this is what I think happens in Spain. In many firms just basically get the funding from real estate, from the mortgages on their houses and their personal houses, and then nobody's willing to give them money outside that sector.
Because there's so much senior debt already.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is related to Yun Chen's point, which is that in our paper, we're imagining a firm that has no senior debt and then suddenly issues it. In our paper, if the firm has already issued senior debt, it's going to be impossible to restructure unless you can find some way of giving seniority above the senior people. So it's true that if a firm, and ours is a paper that also explains why most firms don't issue senior debt until they really have to. So there's one of the puzzles in the finance literature is, when does a firm issue secured debt? Secured debt has greater borrowing capacity because it's safer, but many firms don't issue it at all for a long period of time. And our paper helps explain that. Our paper suggests that you don't want to issue senior debt until the very last moment, because senior debt, it comes with an option value that like you want to exercise this option at the best time. Like if you issue senior debt early, you're preventing yourself from restructuring later. So you want to preserve the restructuring option. How do you preserve the restructuring option? By delaying the issuance of secured debt as long as humanly possible.
Avi, please.
I mean, I lowered my hand, but if I,
Sure.
I will ask it anyway. I mean, it goes back to the question about the endogenizing debt. I mean, it seems to me that since the work of Jensen and McLean, not doing such a thing to say, okay, I'm just analyzing what happens later on, given the things at the beginning that aren't changed. And now I'm asking the question whether I would want to take, if I go back to Jensen and McLean, whether I'm going to take excessive risk or whether I'm going to do not excessive risk because of debt overhang stuff. It's like you are allowing the stealing from debt holders, and you are actually imagining that you took money from someone at the beginning, and now you are allowed to do things later on without them taking this into account. So, I mean, it seems like a good starting point, but without it, it seems to be that it will never be complete, the analysis.
Yeah, so there are two ways to answer that. One is that we were motivated by the pandemic, which was, so you might say our paper has direct application to shocks, economic shocks that suddenly shock a group of firms given their capital structures. So our paper was primarily motivated by the pandemic, and it showed that, okay, when you have a shock, then we can take the debt as exogenous and we can think about what public policies should be appropriate. So that was our primary motivation. So I think our paper does have direct application to pandemics, financial crises. But we also think that in our paper, we can show that it's Pareto efficient to do a restructuring. So in some sense, what we're showing is that you avoid that every creditor is made better off by the ability, in some sense, to steal. So that's the paradox, is that the ability to threaten your junior creditors, force them into a restructuring, actually makes all those junior creditors better off. So here's a policy, and so our intuition, we still have to work it out in the math, but intuition is that if the policy has an ex post Pareto efficient effect, then we think that that's going to have a positive impact on the flow of liquidity ex ante. To be sure, that's a conjecture. We haven't proven it through.
Before we close the session, we only have 1 minute, but I'll try to be brief. And I also have a couple of questions, and I'd like to hear Ed's response very briefly, and otherwise we can communicate through email. But one is in the model, there seems to be common knowledge about all the major parameters, in the sense that there is no asymmetric information. But one could imagine that there may be divergent beliefs of creditors and debtors about theta, about lambda, and even, I mean, probably in the US that is not the case given the structure of bankruptcy law. I think a major difference with most European bankruptcy laws is that in Europe, there is the chance that the debtor will be supervised in bankruptcy, in the sense that the debtor will lose control, which is a big deterrent to file for bankruptcy, in the sense that you don't know exactly which judge you will get, and perhaps you get a judge that will perhaps even entirely replace you, but even if they don't replace you in control of the firm, they may nominate a kind of bankruptcy administrator that will supervise you in a kind of a stringent manner. So therefore, in a way, and this is the second question, because you know perfectly well that in Europe we're discussing about restructuring a lot. Now we have to implement this 2019 preventive restructuring directive. And in a way, to many European countries, the idea is that bankruptcy is a disaster. It doesn't really work well. It's extremely costly. You mentioned the costs in the US, but probably in Europe are much larger. So let's make bankruptcy unattractive, and let's try to make restructuring agreements more, let's say, more organized. And let's try to produce coordination and certain mechanisms, the possibility that senior debt may drag junior debt, also in restructuring and not only in bankruptcy. And perhaps that would be, I'm not saying this is a good idea, but in a way that would be kind of an alternative model to the one you're presenting, which would be US based, just based on plausible assumptions about US bankruptcy and restructuring. But apparently in other institutional contexts, you may think that, well, let's forget about bankruptcy. We cannot really solve its huge problems. Let's go to restructuring, but then make it really give more clout to creditors, especially senior creditors there, and give incentives to the debtor to go early into restructuring and therefore agree to a restructuring.
Yeah, so this is good. So the first is that one of the things I said during my talk is that that when you see bankruptcy not used, like around the world, you can see low usage rates of bankruptcy systems. And Fernando, you've written about that in Spain. And the question is, why is it so rarely used? One story is the one we're telling, is that if a bankruptcy process is really efficient, it won't get used because you'll have bargaining in the shadow of the law and people will restructure instead. But there's another, in our model, we're assuming that the bankruptcy environment preserves value relative to the other option. So what's the other option? I haven't talked about that. In the model and in the real world, the other option is a liquidation under federal law, under non-bankruptcy law. In the United States, we call it state law. But so you might say there's a liquidation environment that's not in bankruptcy, and then there's bankruptcy. And bankruptcy has a cost called lambda. That's the measure of how efficient it is. In our model, we have mu, that's measuring the efficiency of the state environment. And we're always assuming bankruptcy is more efficient. Now, and that means that the more efficient it becomes, the more you get restructuring. But if the bankruptcy environment is radically inefficient, meaning that like lambda is negative, meaning that you waste value relative to what happens outside of bankruptcy, then bankruptcy won't be used either. So you could imagine that in a system where the judges are radically inefficient, no one's going to use bankruptcy either. So a key to our model is that it's describing environments where bankruptcy has a comparative advantage relative to outside environments. And that may not describe a number of countries around the world. With respect to priority, your second question, if I remember it correctly, was, can you summarize it one more time? I just think I just lost the thread for your second question.
Well, I mean, actually, you answered quite a bit the second question. My other point was about whether there's no asymmetric information about the value. So that really facilitates the, let's say, the positive, the complementarity effect that you, I mean, it's a really, the result is really a nice, neat, and illuminating. But the idea is that perhaps in the real world, there may be divergent beliefs about lambda and theta that would make the effect less powerful.
Yeah, so we black box that. In some sense, you could think of ours as, well, originally when we wrote the paper, we thought it's cool because we don't really have the traditional sources of incompleteness. It's a lot of like the Bolton-Sharfstein papers and the others, they find that what looks pathological ex post is actually a feature ex ante using an incomplete contracting model. And ours doesn't have any of the traditional incompleteness, and yet we can make the similar argument that there are these beneficial ex ante effects of inefficiencies ex post, and we don't have to have the traditional sources of incompleteness. But the incompleteness that we're kind of black boxing is, why is there creditor dispersion? Why is there no coordination? And you could say that if we did a micro foundation for that lack of coordination, it could be due to divergence in beliefs. So we could say that implicitly the divergence of beliefs is one source of the disagreement, but we don't directly model that. And there are many ways to model the incompleteness in belief, or this divergence in beliefs that could affect, you're right, that if we took that seriously, it could be, there might be a subset of creditors willing to, like there may be different beliefs about the value of priority. I think that's what you're getting to, is that there may be a subset of creditors who think priority is really valuable, a subset that don't. And so you might have an incomplete restructuring.
Yes.
And you could imagine that a sufficient divergence will cause it all to break down. You
Yeah.
know, so you might say that our paper, and it's a good point, that we do have common beliefs that we rule out that divergence that could cause the breakdown. That's a good point that we should take back to the paper. I don't think we even talk about it anywhere, so it's a good point.
Okay. Well, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I think it's reasonable. Thanks a lot. This was really a great keynote. And thanks everyone for attending, and definitely thanks Ed for a wonderful presentation. Thanks
I want
a
to
lot.
thank you all. Those are great comments, and they were all really hard, especially it's the questions about the endogenizing debt. You know, I did one of those sneaky tricks that presenters do. It was like, yes, there's a big problem in this paper. Let's push it away. And you were good. You came back with it. But thank you. It's a work in progress, and I very much appreciate the comments that will make the paper undoubtedly better.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well,